Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo lo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras se aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to all member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SBDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focus and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children, and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Este video fue producido con la ayuda financiera de la Unión Europea.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to all member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Center's program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing.
En verte, entonces si estás listo voy a comenzar y estamos esperando que se conecta Kevin O'Reilly de State Department y ojalá que pronto lo vamos a tener, pero vamos a comenzar con el parte introductoria de la sesión. Entonces, good morning. On my part, I am James Lambert, the Secretary for Hemispheric Affairs at the Organization of American States, and pleased to welcome all of you here today to this new edition of the Policy Dialogue, Balance of Power and the Safeguarding of Democracy, Reflections on the 20th Anniversary of the Adoption of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Dialogue is being organized by the Summit Secretariat of the OAS in collaboration with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Due Process for Law Foundation, to all of whom I extend my deep gratitude. And I greet and appreciate the participation of the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, as well as the chair of the Summit's process, which will be represented by Kevin O'Reilly, the Summit's National Coordinator of the United States. I also extend greetings to Francisco Guerrero, my colleague, the Secretary of Strengthening Democracy, who will be present through a video, and Maria Selena Conte, who is the Acting Director of the Summit's Secretariat, and thank her and her team for making this session possible. And we're really pleased to be able to count today as well with the participation of many recognized international experts, particularly the moderator of today's dialogue, Katja Salazar, who is the Executive Director of the Due Process for Law Foundation. Once again, Katja, our thanks to you and your excellent panelists, including Trevor Monroe, the Principal Director of the National Integrity Action Jamaica's chapter of Transparency International, Dr. Rodolfo Pisa, former Minister of Government of Costa Rica and advisor to the Secretary General of the OAS, Mary Claire Acosta, who is the Director of Justicia Transicional Mexico and former Undersecretary for Human Rights and Democracy of the Mexican Secretariat of External Relations, and who I knew in that capacity when I was the #2 at the Canadian mission in Mexico some 20 years ago. Joel Hernandez, Commissioner for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and Santiago Canton, Director of the Rule of Law Program of the Inter-American Dialogue and the former Executive Secretary of the Commission. Well, the Charter is a historic document which was adopted in pursuit of representative democracy in the Americas. It represents perhaps the single most salient outcome of the Summit's process, and particularly of the third Summit of the Americas, which was held in Quebec in 2001. Today, we not only commemorate its 20th anniversary, but in light of the current context in the region, the Charter and its principles have become more relevant than ever. And 20 years after its adoption, it's useful to take stock of its application, of the new challenges that the democratic institutions in the regions face. Today's difficult and turbulent context is marked by not only the consequences of COVID-19, but further deterioration of authoritarian tendencies rising among political and social actors, restrictions on fundamental rights being imposed, new citizen demands expressed through social mobilization, political polarization, as well as health and economic crises that have amplified pre-existing social inequities. The session builds on a previous one that we hosted in May 2021, together with the Summits Commission and the Commission on Judicial and Political Affairs of the OAS on Democratic Resilience. And the event is being broadcast on social media with simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish, as well as sign language. And so, without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, who is always eloquent in his support of the Charter and the values that it represents. Secretary General.
Gracias, James. Selina, Katia, encantado de estar con ustedes nuevamente.
I'm happy to be with you all today. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. It's a collective commitment and unique throughout the world, a document that's a international legal instrument. We know that the work on behalf of democracy never ends. If we're going to work, it's an ongoing process to improve, perfect it, make it more efficient. It evolves. So we are commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Charter. We remember that there are many threats to democracy in the Americas. There's tendency of concentration of power and greater power of legislative branches or less power, and attacks of the independence of the judiciary. The OAS is the political forum par excellence of the Americas, where we discuss these issues. The strengthening of democracy, the Inter-American Democratic Charter has always been and should be the place to do so, and the instrument to do so. And the Charter came about when there was lots of authoritarianism in the region, and it was born as a result. It was designed as a defense against the unconstitutional attacks against democratically elected governments, and often leaders depart from democratic practices, and this is an essential point. Many people who come into power become ungrateful to the democracies that brought them to power, and they don't act consistent with democratic principles. But the principles of the Democratic Charter and the principles of democracy are based on separation and independence of the powers of government, are based on exercise of power under rule of law. Most of the time, power cannot be just co-opted under these principles, of course. The COVID-19 pandemic has hit many countries of our region very hard, and have led to and have revealed underlying problems, or structural problems, that is. And so it's hit us quite hard, seeing inequality come to the fore, poverty that exists in the hemisphere. Also, issues linked to separation of powers and freedom of the press and corruption as well have been brought to the forefront as a result of the pandemic, and also centralization of power, concentration of power in the decision-making process has also been a result. And this jeopardizes legitimacy that was so hard earned in our hemisphere. So we have to address all of these principles in the Charter to prevent these happening. So we have to defend the freedom of press, for example, freedom of expression, transparency, uprightness in public administration, and access to information. I call on the electoral observation missions to contribute to upholding the principles of the Democratic Charter. And this year, Article 17 has been applied on 2 instances. We must also point out that the lack of transparency in the use of public resources and corruption in government have increased, and as has mistrust in the government. And this creates dissolution in democracy. This is one of the causes of the weakening of democratic governments in our hemisphere. Transparency, accountability. This is essential for democratic governments and overseeing of the problems and solving them. And so citizens have to be better informed. There must be accountability and transparency, otherwise it cannot be properly informed. Throughout the hemisphere, we're in a state of alert in this regard, given recent events where the separation of powers has been, and the independence of the judiciary are now priorities to uphold, with a commitment of leaning the vis-a-vis corruption was served to make the judiciary more independent based on universal principles that are applicable. And the CAGP has talked about the role of the Democratic Charter, and in the process of the summits, this is an initiative to strengthen the Charter should move forward in interpreting independent judiciaries and respect for constitutions to enforce emergency to buttress emergency powers, but without this being authoritarianism. The Charter is a solution that, through putting together a plan of action which is designed to help the implementation of the democratic Inter-American Democratic Charter. The Inter-American Democratic Charter is a strong legal document at the constitutional level throughout the Americas. It's very compelling and powerful. We can't blame the Charter for the authoritarian tendencies here. It would be a big mistake. It's obviously this is not what should be done. The path we should follow is to accept that we have commitments, each and every country does, to each of the peoples of the Americas, and the General Secretariat of the OAS to promote and defend democracy. Thank you very much, James, for this opportunity to speak.
Pues muchas gracias a usted, Secretario General, and now it's
Thank you, Secretary General.
to the National Summits Coordinator for the United States, Mr. Kevin O'Reilly. Please, Kevin.
Good morning, Secretary General Almagro and Ambassadors Lambert and Guerrero, friends and colleagues. You know, the Americas helped define the era of the world's first revolutions in pursuit of liberty. Philadelphia in 1776, the 1791 slave revolt that in time won Haiti its freedom, South America's independence struggles led by such imposing figures as Bolivar and San Martin. Their pursuit of liberty, of democracy, has defined us. Now, we often fall short of our ideals. My own nation once fought a civil war to decide whether our portion of the Americas would live, as Lincoln said, half slave and half free. It took until last week, only last week, for Virginia to remove a massive statue glorifying one of the leaders of that rebellion. My country's constitution begins, "We the people of the United States," in order to form a more perfect union. A recognition that democracy is a process, a lived experience, a pursuit of the more perfect, not a static thing to place on a shelf and admire. In 2001, in Quebec City, at the third Summit of the Americas, our leaders decided to create an Inter-American Democratic Charter, adopted 5 months later at a special OAS General Assembly in Lima on an otherwise dark day, September 11th, 2001. Article 1 clearly states our commitment and our challenge. The peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy, and their governments have an obligation to promote and defend it. And here's the very next sentence. Democracy is essential for the social, political, and economic development of the peoples of the Americas. So democracy is about more than just the rules of the game. Our founding father here in the US, James Madison, called justice government's very purpose, the very purpose of civil society. The Charter speaks to our hemisphere's high ambitions for justice and democracy's social content, for what we need to do together to enable our citizens to pursue to the fullest their individual and collective destinies. We know that poverty, inequality, and social exclusion threaten our liberties and welfare. Chastened by this pandemic, we include ill health and disease in that list of threats. We build democracy on the bedrock of free and fair elections, but we also need independent courts so that the rule of law prevails over narrow interests, a competent and effective public administration free of corruption, transparent and accountable, to reliably provide essential social services, including health services and quality schools. We need to embrace and vigorously defend the freedom of citizens to speak their minds, to engage in inclusive, peaceful, and constructive dialogue, to write and communicate freely, and to organize and associate without government interference. No true democracy heedlessly invades the rights of its citizens, represses people's thoughts and actions, their ability to speak their minds, their ability to organize. Only a despot would resort to intimidation and force, silence legitimate opposition, turn public security forces into tools of oppression. Democracy withers wherever citizens wait for the late night knock on the door, where they rightly fear arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. President Joseph Biden has placed democracy's renewal among his highest priorities. We know we must do more to make our own society more inclusive, our institutions more responsive. That's our more perfect union challenge. We take it up with great humility, but also with confidence. We've sometimes fallen short of our ideals, but we've worked to bend the arc of history towards justice since the founding of this republic. We know that we've made progress, even as we know we must do more, much more. As we prepare to host the next Summit of the Americas, we want to work in partnership with you, those in government and those from civil society, to promote and defend democracy and human rights across the Americas. The Charter remains a remarkable accomplishment, but no agreement itself defends or promotes democracy. People do that work. People like us, people of goodwill from across our hemisphere. But when put to good use, the Charter is a powerful tool, and we should use it. We consider the Summit of the Americas a process, not just an event. It started with Miami and will continue through next year when our leaders meet and beyond. So here's our challenge: to ensure that this process strengthens our commitment to democracy so that we can show our citizens and the region and the world that democracies and their institutions can meet society's needs and deliver results, not just for the few, but for all. President Biden believes that to tackle the world's most pressing challenges and those of the hemisphere that we share, democracies must come together, learn together, stand together, and act together. And as Summit hosts, we will work with you to do just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Reilly, for your words and also for your leadership of the Summit's process. And now to close the opening session for today, we have words from Francisco Guerrero, who is the Secretary for Strengthening Democracy, who prepared a video for this event.
Muy buenos días a todas y a todos los presentes, delegadas y delegados de los Estados miembros, señor Secretario General de la OAS.
A very good morning to all of you, distinguished members present here, representatives, Secretary General Luis Almagro, James Lambert, all of you. In the framework of democracy, at this time of the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, allow me to begin that in these 20 years since it was subscribed, the Charter has shown itself to be an efficient, powerful, and immensely fruitful instrument because it has awakened the consciousness of many in the citizenry. This Charter is unique in the world, not only because it defends democracy from the standpoint of its declarations, but also because it goes on to establish very precise how-tos, very significant measures by which democracy can be defended. That framework, then, it can be said, is our navigational charter, not only for the member states, but for the Secretary General of the OAS, that charts indeed, in the true sense of the noun, how and where we must go to defend freedoms. The idea is precisely that, how to keep alive such basic representative elements as fundamental freedoms and representation, powers subject to the state rule of law, the holding of periodic free, fair elections that are based on universal and secret suffrage, and the allowance of parties and alliances, and last but not least, of course, the separation of public powers. Now, through these basic tenets of democracy with a capital D, as the format on which we move, the Charter goes on to draw on a number of mechanisms of the Inter-American system itself. And this recalls, does it not, that democracy is not just the holding of elections. No, no. It means counting on governments that in fact do recognize such fundamental freedoms and the exercise of democracy on an everyday basis. There is no room for arbitrariness, and there has to be space for a separation of powers and a curbing of any state entity's excesses in its powers. The interpreter regrets the sound and the image has been frozen. He's come back now. I shall continue. All of this goes to generating trust and confidence in public administration. Now, in the last year and a half, we have seen how embattled democracies have been. This has been a trial by fire for all of the countries in the region. But the OAS has continued in its indomitable struggle for democracy, and in that sense, the Inter-American Democratic Charter is, as it were, a document of guarantees for such exercise. Countries have held elections over this last year and a half in the midst of the pandemic, and the OAS has been right there front and center every time that it was invited to be so. In this time of pandemic, we have managed to allow for the defense of democracy and all of the exercise that undergirds it. So it can be said that the Inter-American Democratic Charter is a roadmap that sets forth fundamental freedoms, economic development, and key peaceful coexistence that is the sine qua non for all peoples in this region and elsewhere as we go through such tremendous challenges. Now, as much as ever, if not more so, we must fight to keep representative democracy alive and well. Separation of powers, freedom of expression, separation of powers, both administrative and judicial, as well as the general exercise of the fundamental freedoms writ large. These are our basic parameters today. The Inter-American Democratic Charter is as useful as ever it was. It is no doubt a guide as to the aspirations of democracies to which the parties, the citizens, civil society, entrepreneurship, in short, all members of society are included and not excluded. That is why it is so fitting that we put our heads together to think again how we can gird those powers of separation and the key tenets on which this Inter-American Democratic Charter is founded as we move on through this 21st century. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much, Francisco Guerrero, for your words and for your leadership in this regard within the General Secretariat of the OAS.
Floor to our moderator, Katya Salazar, who is the Executive Director of the Due Process for Law Foundation. Let me just briefly introduce her. Katya, as I say, is the Executive Director of the Foundation, which is a regional organization whose mandate is to promote the rule of law and human rights in Latin America. And one of the main objectives of the Foundation is to promote judicial independence, and within that framework, advocate for more transparent and meritocratic selection processes for high judicial and prosecutorial authorities. Before joining the Foundation, Katya was the adjunct coordinator of the Special Investigations Unit of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Peru, and was charged with investigating the grave human rights abuses that occurred between 1980 and 2000 in that country. And she was also part of the legal team Coalition Against Impunity in Germany, which filed a criminal complaint against members of the Argentine military for the disappearance of German citizens during the last dictatorship. Katya completed her law studies at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru and a master's degree in public international law at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. So please, Katya, with that, over to you. I believe you're still on mute.
Su micrófono, señora Salazar. So you have to request the floor again, Ambassador Lambert.
Katya, could I ask that you request the floor again? Please, you need to press the blue button on the bottom right of your screen to request the floor.
Now?
We see you. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you very much. Bueno, a ver, en primer lugar, por supuesto, quiero agradecer a la OEA.
Let me begin, it goes without saying, by thanking the OAS and the Summit Secretariat for being so kind as to include me in this excellent meeting to discuss such a key document, which is absolutely the cornerstone of our freedoms in the region. And I thank everyone in advance who will participate in this debate, sharing how ongoing the value of these different elements continues to be in their respective democracies. 20 years following the subscription of this Inter-American Charter, I think it's a good time to take a breath and halt, to weigh up how much it remains valuable and how useful it is to maintain the separation of powers and the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms inter alia. There is no doubt that at the moment when the Charter was in fact subscribed, it represented an enormous step forward in the defense of democracy and the rule of law in this region. However, over the last 20 years, there certainly have been untold number of onslaughts to this democracy. And these onslaughts, these attacks, have become ever more pernicious and more subtle. And I think that academe needs also to pay attention. Who would have said back in 2001, when this charter was forged and subscribed, that what Alberto Fujimori did in 92 in Peru, and that was considered a self-coup d'etat by the president against the other powers of state. Who would have imagined that could occur? Who could imagine back then that in effect, the justice the Justice Departments might be co-opted by organized crime, or the other way around for that matter, that at some point in their respective histories, some courts, some attorneys would have taken a gamble, as we might put it in Peru, to go ahead and have the courage to be the counterpoint, to risk their very lives. And by the way, there, I am not indulging in dramatic metaphors, because as you and I both know, they did risk their lives and sometimes lost. And so each of us, is it not true, from where we stand, from what we do, have been working, I think it's fair to say, over the last couple of decades, precisely to defend democracy, the rule of law, and the defense, protection, and promotion of human rights. We are now poised to begin the second round of this meeting, and so let me, without further ado, move on to introduce first Professor Trevor Monroe. Professor Monroe is from Jamaica. He is Principal Director of National Integrity Action, which is Jamaica's chapter of Transparency International, of TI in Jamaica. But let me also say that Trevor Monroe is part of that international, one of the international chapters of Transparency International. He also is a very well experienced person in the area of transparency, running of accounts. He was a senator of his country for over 10 years, and from that platform, he got a great deal done. And so a warm welcome to you, Trevor. We also are fortunate to have with us Rodolfo Pisa, the advisor at the Office of the Secretary General of the OAS, where he heads up the Observatory for Democracy and Integral Development in the Americas. Now, he was launched as a minister of his country in Costa Rica. He was also a member of the Supreme Court of that country, and also headed up the Social Security Administration in Costa Rica. Welcome, Rodolfo Pisa. Let me also welcome Marie-Claire Acosta. Now, Marie-Claire, Director of Justicia Transnacional Mexico, Transitional Justice in Mexico, has also worked as Undersecretary for Human Rights and Democracy in the Mexican Secretariat of Foreign Affairs. She's also worked in civil society areas, and she also headed up the anti-corruption group in Mexico some years ago. Let me also welcome Joel Hernandez, Commissioner of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He was its president until just last year. And amongst other salient positions, he worked with the rapporteurship for justice operators. He was also an ambassador for his country many years and permanent representative of Mexico at the OAS. I don't remember exactly when that was, Joel, but I knew you were there. And you were, in fact, the representative of Mexico during the last reform of the Inter-American human rights system. We have also a former head of the IACHR, former executive secretary, Santiago Canton. We remember him very well, as he played that important role over 11 years. He's currently director of the Rule of Law program of the Inter-American Dialogue. Santiago has also worked with the Kennedy Center for Human Rights, and he was the director for Latin America and the Caribbean in Guyana. But we have also, with great pleasure, Fernando Carrillo, former Attorney General of Colombia. It is most unfortunate that Fernando Carrillo had trouble with his flights and, alas, cannot participate with us today. So without further ado, I hope I can be seen, because I don't have a view on the room. I'm looking at myself. I can't view anybody else. So let's begin then with the first round of questions. Now, let me beg you, please, please do not exceed your speaking time. You have maximum 5 minutes to share your views in every one of the question series. Now, the first has to do with the context that we are presently living in this moment of grave challenges and threats in the region. And as we said earlier, these threats have become ever more sophisticated. And so within the framework of the principles established by the Inter-American Democratic Charter, how can the principle of separation of powers and strengthening thereof can move forward? What advice could we give the OAS? How can we move to make the charter more effective? Do you think we need new mechanisms, or is it a matter of using those we have more creatively within the overall inter-American system? So here we go. Trevor will be speaking to us in English, but we have the fortune of having simultaneous interpretation into Spanish. So Trevor, you have the floor.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we hear you. Hi, Trevor. Go
I'm
ahead.
speaking now. Well, first of all, may I express my appreciation for your kind words of introduction, and even more importantly, for this invitation to participate in the extremely important conversation on the balance of power and strengthening of democracy in the hemisphere. I believe it is important for us to share in the pride that has been expressed earlier on in the survival of so many of the principles and practices of the on this 20th anniversary. Free elections, fair elections. The hemisphere is among the regions of the world with less voter support and percentage of participation among the high. That is something to be proud of. On the 20th anniversary, it's important for us to take into account the views and opinions of the peoples of the hemisphere. Fortunately, we have every 2 years a study, the Latin American Public Opinion Project out of Vanderbilt University with collaboration from other institutions, which survey the opinions and perspectives of people across 18 countries of the hemisphere. And the people are telling us that things are not as good as they ought to be. And I want to share, to begin, some of the concerns of the people of the hemisphere expressed in the 2018-2019 survey of democracy in Latin American and Caribbean region. We note that in 2004, the level of satisfaction with democracy was at 52.3% of the peoples in our area. In 2018, 2019, this has declined to 39.6%. In Jamaica, the level of satisfaction is at 32%, and only Colombia, Panama, Peru, the people have a less level of satisfaction. So the people are saying we are not satisfied with democracy. In terms of support for democracy, that too has declined. When the charter was formed in 2001, 3 years after, the level of satisfaction was 67.6. Now that is down to 50. And so the people are saying we need to get better performance. The recent election, the COVID election, very important, and it's a source of pride that elections have been held relatively free and fair on the COVID pandemic. But of the 14 elections held in 2020 in the Caribbean and elsewhere, only one had a higher percentage of voter turnout than the average over the previous period. And that is something to be aware of. In fact, 13 of the 14 elections had a lower turnout than in the previous pre-pandemic elections. Of course, part of the reason for that would have been the pandemic itself. But in the Jamaican case, which is typical, this continued a worrying trend started many years ago, and the election voter support turnout was 37%, the lowest in 70 years of free and fair elections in our country. And of course, we know the concern in the elections in Haiti, where it took 3 months for the results to be declared. So, my brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, the people are saying we have to do better. And that is why this conversation is so timely in terms of reinforcing the principles and practices of the Charter. In that regard, I believe that we will have to develop a plan of not just a statement of nice words. We had that in the Lima Declaration 2 years ago, and it's good to have statements, but we need to go beyond that. And this dialogue today needs to come up with practical suggestions, certainly in the Caribbean, to strengthen the judicial independence. We in Jamaica have had a mixed experience recently, which we can talk about later on. Very positive in the judiciary asserting its independence, but also concerns regarding the extent to which that is guaranteed. So we will hopefully come up with practical suggestions to ensure that the confidence, the support, and the satisfaction of our peoples in the Caribbean and beyond is increased beyond where it is now, the significant decline over the last 20 years. I believe that my 4 or 5 minutes is up, so we can speak more fully later on in looking at the rounds of our conversation.
Hello, can you hear me now? Okay, excuse me. I believe Trevor is now completed his response. Thank you very much, Trevor, for your participation. As we mentioned, that there is a pending subject or a pending business with regard to lessons learned in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there was, in preparation for that meeting that we held we realized there was a huge gap in this regard. And everyone who's here, the OAS, the Inter-American system in general, we can make a contribution. Now I give the floor to Rodolfo, who has to turn his camera on for 5 minutes, please. Rodolfo, if you could. Thank you very much, firstly, for the invitation. Greetings, Secretary General, and all the panel members who I am honored to know. It seems to me that with regard to the questions that were raised, I want to make some clarification. There's difficulty in promoting democracy in the context that we're living right now. Latino Barometer, the Bennett Institute, other public opinion companies underscore that in the last decade, but as of 2006 particularly, there's been less support for democracy. And what's even more serious is that the support of youth is even lower now. And however, in the first stages of populist governments that whether it's left or right wing, that satisfaction tends to increase. It goes back down, and it ends up rejecting these governments, and it goes back down. But this is something I want to bring to your attention. The second thing, and it's obvious that I share the concerns that have been raised with regard to democratic resiliency and the role of the Inter-American Democratic Charter in May of 2021 and the different ways to enforce the Charter. I have no issue with any of these, and I find it all very positive. But in addition to the the preventive and restorative actions. I'd also want to underscore diplomatic efforts. I'm not talking about the Royal Academy Dictionary definition of this, but rather I'm talking about conflict management without causing too much hostility. This is not just about public policy actions or condemnation, etc. They're necessary, but also democratic support, accompaniment, fewer public policies, but fewer policies, but that are more decisive. I've worked in human rights in the 80s, in the beginning of the 80s, and at that time, most countries had dictatorships in our countries, and I played a role in the International Red Cross Committee dealing with political prisoners vis-a-vis the Amnesty International role. Both was necessary. But I think this silent effort is needed to address this. In November of 2019, I was sent as representative to Bolivia to deal with or to try to find a solution. We know what the programs were. There was a new government. There were structural problems had come about, etc. But the task at hand was to meet with all the different sectors, the provisional government, the opposition leaders, the parliamentary leaders, etc., in the Senate, and with the different parliamentary groups, and with civil society, of course, as well. And what happened in this instance, I raised 3 topics, obviously, in diplomatic tradition. Remember that Evo Morales was being held in an embassy at the time. But remember, the Inter-American Commission was to arrive a week later. That was essential because there was going to be a certain reluctance to accept the commission. But we eliminated a decree that brought about conflict with rule of law, and we built unanimously an electoral tribunal. In the different the party ended up accepted this new constitution, accepted the majority's view, and they accepted to create a unanimously elected electoral tribunal, etc. So this process gave rise to a substantive change in the country. Of course, this delay in holding the elections, which are scheduled for May, and then because of the pandemic, they were postponed. It was postponed, and there were. But it seems to me that the diplomatic task should not fail to underscore or not only condemnations and restorative and preventive actions, which are essential. They're the main actions that have to be taken. Of course, that's what's required is for the government that is committing these acts needs international validation from the countries around it. And it's easier to convince a country that has relationships that appreciates its relationship with Europe and the United States than to convince countries that don't appreciate this and don't value this relationship and that don't have any concern to maintain such relations. So that is my answer to the first question. Thank you very much, Rodolfo, for reminding us, firstly, of the recommendations that were issued in the May meeting of this year with regard to the Summit of the Americas, and as we awaited, and then the importance of diplomatic efforts as well, which are also important, together with naming and shaming, which is the job of other actors, of course. So this speaks to the relevance that diplomatic efforts play, the role that they play. So now I give the floor at this time to Santiago. We can't hear you, Santiago. Oh, thank you, Katia. Okay. I think the three questions that were asked can be answered in one answer, but I want to touch on all these different topics, but I don't want to muddle everything. So I believe that the main thing I have to take into account, and this is based on my personal experience and the different jobs that I've held, positions I've held, and also academic opinions that I've seen. If you don't have political vocation, if there's not a democratic vocation, it's very difficult to bring about any changes in a country. The political and democratic vocation can't be taught. It can't even be imposed. In the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, we've seen this. There were changes when countries had the political will to bring about these. That's the first thing I want to bring up in response to the questions. There's also something very specific and concrete that I think I should mention, and that I think will answer the three questions. And that's the Democratic Charter. Clearly, it has worked in some areas. It hasn't worked in major areas to prevent these anti-democratic movements. This is happening more than ever right now. There's an end to a lot of democracies, and the Democratic Charter was created precisely to prevent this from happening. So why does this happen? Because the Charter lacks the independence of the bodies that are supposed to follow up, but they don't have the proper independence from the states to be able to make any headway towards enforcement of the Democratic Charter. For example, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, it drafted the first draft, looked at it, that was put forward by Peru, because there needs to be independence to evaluate the situation of a country. So what can be done to turn this around is to create a mechanism under the Democratic Charter and in the context of the OAS, the framework of the OAS, a follow-up mechanism that's not among peers, inter-peer, which makes things difficult. It doesn't work. It makes it very difficult, but create a special commission that's independent to follow up on the Democratic Charter. It should be elected by the states or the Secretary General that could assess the democratic reality of any country of the region at any time. And how would this commission would be put into operation? Well, it would ask the Permanent Council, the Secretary General, or it could be self-invoked by states, 2 or 3. I don't know what the details would be exactly, but this special commission or committee with broad participation of civil society has to conduct an assessment of the specific situation in the particular country that has asked for this to be done, or it decides on its own to do so. This evaluation has to be public without any pressure from the Secretary General and it should be able to make decisions. And if a decision doesn't make with regard to the recommendations, and so it bears the weight, the OAS bears the weight of not fulfilling the recommendations. Efforts to achieve this have been from civil society. Mary Claire, who's here, has done it. They've never worked these efforts because it's not in the framework of the OAS and the Charter. It's not set forth explicitly. I think it's the only possibility we have to turn things around, what's happening now, and to give the Democratic Charter the teeth it needs. We say the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has teeth. It doesn't have a lot of teeth, but it has some teeth, and this would help to give it its teeth. It's an excellent document, this Democratic Charter, but it needs teeth, and this would be a way of giving it a stronger tool, to the OAS, so that it can make headway in this regard. I'll stop there because I believe this was the main question that was posed. And I think there's other questions that other people have to answer. Thank you, Santiago. Thank you for reminding us. Let's remember this element, which is fundamental in the work of the OAS. This tension that exists between promoting democracy and human rights on the one hand, rule of law, and defending it all. But on the one hand, but on the other hand, to be a organization that's made up of the states themselves. So how to deal with, how to manage, how do you how do you raise the profile of these infringements of democracy and rule of law when, as you say, inter-peer commission would be involved? So this idea that you propose, in May, this came up. Another group of experts proposed the creation, not necessarily of a commission, but ad hoc groups of independent experts that can act in specific situations, taking away from lightening the load on the institution itself. Because, as you say, it is an inter-peer, it's between pars. So now I give the floor to Marie Claire Acosta. Good morning to everyone, and it's an honor and a privilege to share this panel discussion with you to talk about such an important and crucial topic to all of us. Okay, I'd like to say that I fully endorse what's been just said. And additionally, as Katia said, the creation of a commission, an independent commission that is a very consequential way or important way of opening the OAS to the people. Because obviously, to sustain democracy in the conditions that are taking place, that attacks, assaults on democracy in our region, in light of this is very linked to the support from citizens. One of the very troubling issues we're seeing in the hemisphere pertains to the fact that governments, all of them, that attack democracy are elected governments, elected movements. And they undermine the norms and institutions of democracy. And in response to this, the OAS cannot do anything but open up to a broader participation of citizens. And I would say closer contact with the citizens of the nations to emerge from this space that's dominated by the states. And it's at an impasse. And so I think it's very important. One of the recommendations that was put forward by the working group that was convened to review the Inter-American Democratic Charter between CISC and CIJP, and that we have to systematize, sort out the experiences where the charter has been activated and invoked to see what failed. So what I believe we have to do, and this can't be done alone by the OAS, but we must get the OAS out of its limited environment where that it operates in, and expand it, reach out to the population of the Americas. How to do it? Well, through academic linkages, linkage with civil society organizations. In other words, there must be an important OAS outreach effort to, in addition, these early warnings of the deterioration of democracy, and we have to become aware of them and try to counter them, not only in the permanent council and the institutions of the system, the Inter-American system, but also political parties must get into the mix, the opposition parties, business organizations, civil society, etc. I believe this is something that must be done. The Inter-American Democratic Charter is an extraordinary instrument, but I don't believe it's a well-known document throughout the region. And when I say this, I don't even believe that in universities and think tanks, people are aware of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I don't think they are. I think we have to make a gargantuan effort to reach out, mobilize based on democratic values, and the charter has the elements to do this. Within it, with greater imagination, with more purposefully than we've done in the past, and not depend on the Secretary General to issue a press release, or the Inter-American Commission also issue a pronouncement, a statement. This must be different than that, and it has to be, there's got to be a different discourse, because what's happened in our region is that the erosion of democracy has used discourse as a dangerous tool to undermine democracy and rule of law, and the organs of the system use a language that's very technical, very legal, and far from the ability to comprehend of large swaths of the population. And so I would say, in my view, of course, that it's fundamental, essential, that the purpose of the upcoming summit, which is to reinforce the independence of judiciary, but I would wonder, in a region where access to justice of the population is so precarious, how can we, leaving aside the elite setting, how can we reinforce the notion that judicial independence is absolutely essential for peaceful coexistence? So these are my ideas. There'll be another opportunity to expound further. Thank you very much.
Siguiente ronda de preguntas toca el tema de la independencia de los tribunales y las cortes, ¿no?
Well, as it happens, this very next set of questions touches precisely on the judicial independence to which you have alluded, and what the role of the courts, in fact, is. What we see in terms of democracy and the rule of law in the region, nonetheless, is something that we must bear in mind when we start thinking of any kind of recommendation. And I refer here to the fact that everything you have described has been the result of elections. Thank you. And to close this first round of questions, I'm pleased to give the floor to Joel Hernandez. Thank you so much, Katia. Let me thank the Summit Secretariat and the General Secretariat of the OAS to have invited us, and I'm particularly very, very pleased to be on such a distinguished panel with so many good friends. The only thing that I deeply regret is that we cannot hold such an important meeting face to face. But hope springs eternal, and let's hope that next time that will change. So let me get right down to it and react to what my colleagues have said. And I begin with what Santiago has said. Santiago, as ever, the agent provocateur, thinking very much ahead, an independent commission that would be established to weigh up the state of democracy. Well, I agree with him on that point, let me say, if indeed that evaluation is carried out amongst peers and quite independent of the political bodies of the OAS. But there are numbers of other contexts that are political in nature that will certainly bear on how the member states speak up, either individually or collectively. That has to be borne in mind as well. That said, let me go back to what Rodolfo Pinzon said when he emphasized the role of a discrete diplomacy in order to assist us in attaining those lofty goals of democracy. Because without any doubt, the sort of commission that Santiago has suggested has, of course, necessarily to be rooted, as he himself admitted, in a very robust and vibrant democracy. And there's the rub, because coming up with consensus in today's dispensation is not an easy thing. So I would look a little bit differently at the sacrosanct principle of separation of powers, not so much looking at it top down, but rather the inverse, Let's look at it from the bottom up, I would suggest. Let's take a hard look at what's going on within the countries with regard to strengthening their public powers. What is it that is allowing those different countries to reach and to maintain the principles of separation of powers? Well, in the Inter-American Commission, as many of you know, there has been ongoing work on the very subject, the independence of the judiciary. Now, why is that? Well, quite simply because the judiciary is the control on all the other public authorities, and it is the guarantor of constitutionality, legality, and the viability, therefore, of public action on behalf, all of those efforts, of the presumed victims. And that is precisely why the Inter-American Commission pays so much attention to the nature and the exercise of power by the judiciary. Now, we pay enormous attention to the training and election of judges, men, women, and public defenders, men, women, in order to assist in accessing justice and ensuring that due process is held. But what occurs is that in many countries of the region, this is happening in an absence of guarantees of independence, both individually and collectively. And my fellow panels, dear Katya, have already pointed out the emergence of new challenges that have cropped up and that are bedeviling the justice operators, even as they had operated thus far. And many times, as we know, it is through the social media, through cybernet, that some of the most virulent attacks have been launched, and to great havoc in the actual everyday work of the justice operators. So this is a challenge for public powers, but also we must think of non-state agents that are also very active in putting in their oar, in weighing in for their part on the ability with which the public can have recourse to justice. And there we have, therefore, also to think of the lack of institutional constructs within the states that would allow them to resist any onslaught by quarters and sources that are not of the state itself. And so we need to be wide-eyed, and in my judgment, this has to be part of, and indeed the core of, what the Inter-American Commission is doing now, or should be doing now, that is strengthening the judiciary. Now, there are numbers of other issues, the process of selection and appointment of justice operators, the launching of their initial career, the ability to ensure, or at least promote, that there is autonomy from a financial standpoint of said operators, and that these operate at international levels, most especially, yet again, the respect for due process, by which I also include necessarily the ability to remove people from office if that is deemed necessary. So I'm not being limited in my reference to the various principles on which this independence of the judiciary must operate. Impartiality, integrity, and full competence in the exercise of their respective functions is of the essence, and we therefore would support that vision of independence. It's all very good and well to talk about independence, but what does it really mean when you get down to it? A bottom-up approach, and always an eye on representative democracy within the states. Thank you very much, Joel, says Katya, the moderator, and this is a perfect launching pad for the second round of questions, which speaks particularly to judicial powers, the threats to systems of justice, to the ministers of justice and various attorneys general and others. Everything that you have said is certainly to the point. But I would sum up the following. What role can and should the Indo-American system play to facilitate the realization of these aspirations? For me, it's a pretty clear picture. What can we do? What recommendations can we actually focus on? This is the core of our second round, and I invite you to consider this. What can we do to strengthen the administration of justice in our region? And I would say, not what can the Indo-American system do, but what more can the Indo-American system do? There's the rub. So, and by the way, let me just launch the following idea for what it's worth. I have asked myself numbers of years, just as the OAS, as we all know, goes right and left to be present at elections, to observe how these things, well, why doesn't the OAS play a role in observing the election of the judicial powers? Because, as we all know, those standards are very well defined. That's not the issue. The issue, is it not, is whether and to what extent those standards are actually met. And I ask this question in a broad sense, thinking creatively as to what the OAS might do, launch into the judiciary observation as it does into elections. But here we go in the same round as we did before, and we look forward, therefore, Trevor, to hearing you as to your experience in the Caribbean.
Trevor, is here. You have to push mute and yeah.
Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me?
And the camera.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Ush.
Yeah, Katia, go
A
ahead.
ver. Trevor, can you talk to see if we can hear you? Uh-oh. He doesn't speak Spanish. Can you speak with him in English?
So, Mr. Trevor, can you please request to speak again?
Have been raised are really fundamental regarding the independence of the judiciary. First of all, the experience in the Caribbean combines positive and negative. On the negative side, in many of the Caribbean states, the executive seeks to intrude on the powers of the judiciary, and there is inadequate resistance among the population. However, in recent times, the Jamaican experience has much to teach us. At a moment when the executive sought to intrude on the powers of the judiciary, there was a tremendous outcry, not only from the judges themselves, who stood their ground. For the first time in history, there was in effect a strike by the judiciary. But more importantly, civil society, National Integrity Action, the Bar Association, the Advocates Association, the media came out in support of judicial independence and against executive intrusion. What this tells us is that the constitutional provisions are important. However, far more important is the concern of the people, their understanding of the importance of the independence of the judiciary and their preparedness to stand up for it. For that reason, I strongly support the proposal that in any kind of action to renew democracy in the Americas, that the OAS includes in that plan the recommendations made at the Lima Conference, Commitment Number 4, developing a culture of citizen participation and prevention of corruption, strengthening democratic and civic values from early childhood and throughout life. by implementing teaching and learning programs at all levels of education, as well as ongoing education programs. In Jamaica, there has long been a proposal to teach civic values at the primary school, secondary school, universities, and professional institutions. This needs to be implemented not only in the Caribbean, but throughout the Americas. It's the ultimate defense of the independence of the judiciary and the principles of the democratic charter are to be defended. It has to come from the grassroots, and the OAS has an important role to play in developing programs and getting funding to support civil society and the educational and professional institutions, which ultimately will determine the extent to which the judiciary is going to be regarded as independent. Secondly, the judges themselves have an important role to play. The most recent Latin American Public Opinion Project survey of the region found that 63% of the Latin American people felt that little or no confidence that judges will punish the guilty. In a survey done in the Caribbean, for
Perdón,
7
Katia,
countries,
¿puedo
5 or
sugerir
6
que
years
cuando se
ago,
resuelva el
the
problema
majority of the
damos la
people
palabra?
believed that the judges would not punish, the court would not punish the rich and the well-connected. That has to change. The judges have a responsibility, as well as the OAS, to ensure that the population recognizes the importance of the independence of the judiciary. Our experience is that is the ultimate guarantor that the executive will not be able to get away with intruding on the powers of the judges. Thank you very much.
Creo que terminó. Did you finish?
I'm sorry, I was saying that you can hear Trevor interpreting into Spanish. That interpretation came out very well. It wasn't the original English we were hearing, it was precisely the interpretation into Spanish, which is what we wanted. Let me now give the floor to Rodolfo Pisa, the second on our list of speakers for considering this new question. Very good, thank you. Well, I think what is abundantly clear is that democracy in our hemisphere until some time ago was really embattled by very serious attacks, coup d'etat, dictatorships, etc. But what is occurring today, alas, is that there is still a very great attack, but not as frontal, not as obvious. It's a little bit an infringement, a little by little sort of thing. Now, think of Mussolini, who back in the day was named as prime minister in Italy, and he said at one point that it is not the actual apparatus that separates us from democracy. Nobody wants to eliminate elections, Miss Mussolini used to say, but we will simply use them as we see fit. That's the difference. And I think that famous thought of the dictator Benito Mussolini is quite opposite today, because many are doing the very thing in our hemisphere today. And numbers of people have said, have they not, oh, well, we're all in favor of workers speaking out. They can carry out whatever revolution they think is necessary if they want to use peaceful means of expression. The International Working Men's Association said that in 1872, way back more than a century ago. So what I'm saying is that there are many ways to twist a concept. And when we remember how a populist arises, let's remember that most populists are elected. But then thing doesn't start there. There is a kind of an ongoing environment in which that populism and that increased authority actually takes root. And when there is, for instance, high levels of criminality and corruption and unrest, a lot of people end up even, they may or may not admit it, being in favor of a coup d'etat because something's got to be done. And so when you have very rigid constitutions of very clear parameters, it isn't equally clear how one goes forward. Where, however, the institutionality is weak and an economic and social crisis arises, the possibilities of danger to democracy are huge. At best, it's a deterioration, a weakening, an erosion of democracy. And at worst, quite frankly, an erosion of the concept of democracy itself. Now, as to the independence of the judiciary, as we used to say, well, you've got to avoid being co-opted. But that doesn't fall from the sky. You've got to have a majority democratic position to ensure that's the case. And indeed, to that end, I think it's important to concentrate on what is really important, the defense of liberty, the defense of the Constitution, as the American Constitution sets forth, for instance, but not to try to get down into the weeds, as it were, and to get down into minute elements of the text when one thinks one is defending them. Second and thirdly, not aim to somehow change the executive and legislative traditional roles. Look at the European Court on Human Rights that has spoken on that, and I think very wisely. Fourthly, I think it's important to have some kind of self-containment. Institutions can live with indifference, but they cannot live with an outright rejection and frontal assault on basic principles. And it's vital not to be perceived as to be the enemy of majority thinking. And take a hard look at judges that may have their pluses, but who are not viewed favorably by the majority, who do not have support at home. And there again, the European Tribunal has opined very wisely. Sometimes when policies appear biased, they are still upholding the population. When, for instance, there are limitations on presidential elections, one can easily forget the level of independence of those tribunals, and some may view them as becoming the instruments of power. That isn't necessarily and should not be the case. So what I'm saying is it's all very fine and well to speak of judiciary independence. However, it is equally important to think of democracy writ large.
Importantes desde dentro, ¿no? Porque tú has sido.
Thank you, Rodolfo. Yeah, the Costa Rican Supreme Court's judgment, bringing that is very important. Important comments. Now I'll give the floor at this time to Santiago Canton. Thank you very much, Katia. As I said at the beginning, the three questions from a practical point of view can be answered and with a single question, so I may be a bit repetitive. So differentiating between 2001 and today, what's the difference? When the Democratic Charter is approved, the rich content wasn't introduced in it, and it's an extraordinary document, the region at that time did not have the legal precedent, the rich legal precedents that it's developed as of today. In 2001, things were very different from now with regard to judicial independence. The legal precedent, the case law created by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the Inter-American Human Rights Protection System, it's developed quite a bit. So today, you can say quite correctly with regard to the case law, when there's no judicial independence based on this decade has been extraordinary and has made a real difference. And so now you can use Inter-American case law to point out when there's no longer judicial independence. True. One. Two, I think that 20 years ago I read an article about Doug Carruthers. Many of you must know him, him. He was speaking about work in Latin America with regard to judicial independence since the 1950s, and since it had been a failure for different reasons. We all know what the reasons that it failed back then, but the independence of the judiciary are written into the constitutions of almost every single country of the region, of our country. So what can we do to ensure and guarantee that independence? It's very difficult. Education, obviously, is important, and to train and educate, inform. But at the same time, we must distinguish between pending debts and urgency. The pending debts to work from bottom up and locally and expand the concept of judicial independence. That's one of the urgent topics. May 1st, when President Bukele threw out the Constitutional Chamber judges of the Constitutional Court of El Salvador, that's a violation without question of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. We have to act in response to such a situation. This isn't normal. Where one thing is that this happens in situations where democracy is working, but we have to, in Nicaragua, are we going to train and educate about the judicial independence? No, there's two things that have to do, to pick up on the comment made by Joel earlier. It's true what Joel said. When diplomacy is silent, but if diplomacy, making some noise, doesn't go hand in hand with other movements, then it doesn't do anything as democracy gets undermined. And so what we need is, again, I go back to what I said in the first answer, an independent commission in the framework of the OAS to say in El Salvador there's no longer democracy because what President Bukele did was anti-democratic. It rides roughshod over the democratic charter, and this can be done. We can create such a commission. It's what we say in the El Salvador report. It's what's requested by the Secretary General. This is fundamental. It's absolutely essential to be able to so that the silent diplomacy, which I know has been done in El Salvador by many countries of the region and elsewhere, it's not going to work if it doesn't go hand in hand with another effort. When there's a leader who has no appreciation for democracy and rule of law, as you said, used to say in the Inter-American Commission, that some things have no solution, but we have to come up with one and pursue this. So that's pretty much exactly, I clocked in at 5 minutes. There you go. Thank you very much, Santiago. Very interesting, your ideas, nuancing Joel's comments. Now I give Marie Claire the floor. Yes, okay, thank you. Today, there was a story in the New York Times that says Bukele has placed El Salvador at the edge of authoritarianism. I haven't seen anything from the OAS on this. No pronouncement, no position, nor any position with regard to Nicaragua from the OAS. So I believe that if we want to defend the democratic charter and if we want to defend democracy in our region, we must implement a system that's much more agile and nimble under the framework of the OAS for urgent action in this regard. We can use silent diplomacy and good offices, etc., but we also need naming and shaming, because naming and shaming raises the specter of these crimes in these countries, crimes against democracy. And this would provide a tool to citizens to defend their democracy. And that's where I underscore that the OAS must make a greater effort. And it must adapt to the times. And so I don't know if it's been done yet or not, but for example, Due Process of Law Foundation has done it quite a bit, establish roadmaps, guidelines to make sure that standards are, Inter-American standards are fulfilled when it comes to judicial independence. I don't know if the Inter-American Commission has produced a compilation of such cases. Last night I was looking at the hearings that the Inter-American Commission has had on judicial independence and how it's affected human rights. And there's a high number of hearings that have been held on this topic. Huge amount of information and experiences. I don't know if this can be processed, sorted out, and once again, made available to the public. And to break out of this vicious cycle of staying within our walls, so to speak, because the countries are at risk. And there's been an opportunity to take part in engagement with civil society organization, academia. There's a lack of awareness of the Inter-American standards on this. It's outrageous. There's no dissemination. They're not well known. So I am going to insist on this. And also I believe the issue of corruption is something that has to be linked, or viewed, that is, with other eyes at the OAS. Attacks, assaults on judicial independence in this era of assaults on democracy often corruption is used that exists in judiciaries as an excuse to dismantle the entire judiciary. So I believe that we have to undertake efforts, and the Commission, Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, has issued a report on corruption. What we have to do is see how can we dismantle these corruption networks without affecting judicial independence. And lastly, I believe there is a urgent topic in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. I understand the capacity of the Commission is the ICHR the capacity has been surpassed. But with regard to precautionary measures and other measures, when there's an attack on the judicial dependence or access to justice, these mechanisms like precautionary measures should be invoked, should be used. We have a year. One case is waiting for a request for precautionary measures is waiting for a year. We want them to be protected by the Commission, and there has even been attempts on the people's lives that are supposed to be the beneficiaries of precautionary measures. So, well, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much, Marie Claire. Indeed, we, civil society, and other organizations, we're aware of this trove of standards and case law and cases and information with regard to judicial independence, but also nobody knows what to do. We see that trove on the one hand, but on the other hand, states do whatever they want. Not what they want, but they put people in who should not become members of the judiciary, etc. There should be independent experts panels, independent panel of experts. We call on them to monitor and evaluate and assess this judge selection process, to have an opinion that's different from that of the state bodies and oversight bodies, to be able to compare and nuance the decisions that are made by public institutions with the independent body's opinion, with candidates to such important positions using the inter-American system. That's what I wanted to convey. Just in civil society, we're trying to think outside of the box. It would be interesting for the inter-American institutions to also think up a way, a mechanism, and a creative way to tap into this trove of information and cases, etc. And so now I give Joel Hernandez of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights this time. Thank you, Katia. The truth is that 5 minutes is not going to be enough for me to reply to such rich ideas that have been laid out. And Katia, thank you for perhaps you can bring us together in person one time to continue to discuss fully all of this. I want to talk about something that's fundamental. I am convinced of the collective defense of democracy, and I believe that is the ultimate goal of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Of course, we must distinguish between states that have democratic tendencies or willingness to cooperate with international human rights organizations, civil society, in strengthening its judiciary, and other states that don't have that political will. It's very clear, as Santiago has said, that there's a group of countries that, regardless of good offices of the Commission and regardless of discreet diplomacy efforts, there's a need to gain access to these states. This is absolutely clear to me, and therefore I believe we must combine with the different tools that have been developed by international organizations over the course of the years to be more effective in strengthening the the branches of government, particularly the judiciary. On the one hand, Katia, you brought up in the prior segment about naming and shaming. One of the functions of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is to create awareness about the human rights situation throughout the continent. That is its first and foremost, its major function. In Article 43.1 of the American Convention on Human Rights is where it's laid out. And it's been followed over the course of the years, and more recently with regard to concerns on and disruption of democracy. And so there have been recent cases, the Commission has expressed great concern. And when it has issued a position or a pronouncement in the case of, for example, of reforms and Salvadoran legislation to be able to remove early these judges from the Supreme Court, there has been a press release issued by the Commission which speaks of the autonomy and independence that there should be and it doesn't depend on any other kind of pronouncement of the political bodies of the OAS. It's the Commission that has to issue such pronouncements, and we did do so. So there's an obligation of the political bodies of the OAS to defend, collectively defend democracy, but also we have to be realistic. We have to look at the fact that there are links between states, the prevailing situation that can put a damper on any pronouncements of the political bodies with regard to these things that happen. And so there has to be political will to create a body, as Santiago suggests, but it would be another instrument to deal with this situation. The Inter-American Commission must continue, however, operated on the basis of its own mandate. Now I move to the other topic, a topic that is related to accompaniment and support to state to strengthen their judiciaries. I do see a lot of feasibility to be able to propose other forms of support. Katia brought some up, for example. A company help states in their process of judge selection, judicial selection process. This is something that should be done. It's being done by due process of law. Civil society, no question, has gone very far in developing these standards. And there's also international practice that's quite extensive that can be placed, made available to the states for this. So I stress, it is going to be necessary here to have discreet and effective diplomacy to change the willingness, the mind of states, and enable this international help or assistance, that the purpose of it will be to strengthen national institutions, and we can see steps towards better democracy in the states. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Joel. Thank you to each and every one of you. We're on the final stretch of our meeting. There's a final round with one more question with regard to recommendations for joint efforts with different actors of the Inter-American system, civil society, academia, the General Secretariat, but also others from the Inter-American system should be understood in a broader sense as a whole. And so here, what we ask is, was it possible to promote impactful joint and coordinated initiatives? Do you have any ideas in regard that could be linked to training, education, promotion of legislators, promotion, etc.? So I would say 3 minutes for each one so that we can close out this last round. 3 minutes maximum. Please look at the time at the in the upper left at the timer. We'll start in the same order as the last round. Let's start with Trevor. Trevor, are you there?
Por favor, pongan el canal en español, porque ahí se le escucha mejor a Trevor.
Spanish channel to hear Trevor better in the interpretation.
Okay, go ahead, Trevor. You have to push your mute.
Trevor, take yourself up.
In relation to the proposals coming out of the May joint meeting, I fully agree that the summit should have developed a plan of action. The plan of action focus on the preventative rather than the restorative aspects for a charter. And in that regard, it is fundamental to develop technical cooperation programs to spread, to promote democratic culture and arrest and reverse alienation from democratic attitudes and behavior, and the increasing turn of too many of our citizens towards authoritarian attacks on democratic institutions as tools of the elite. The technical cooperation programs should focus on two levels. One, the young people. And in that regard, we have experience in Jamaica, the establishment of integrity clubs in schools and at the university level. The spreading of civic values is of some considerable importance. This returns us to the Lima Commitment number 4, which stresses this important aspect of civic education and citizen participation. Secondly, it should focus on strengthening relationships with civil society organizations who have a particular responsibility to strengthen citizens' awareness and to mobilize the citizenry in a context where the executive may overreach in its relationship to the judiciary or the legislature in undermining the separation of powers. So my main point, we need a plan of action. The plan of action needs to focus on the preventative aspects. Indeed, on Articles 26 and 27, of our charter. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Trevor. Entendí que terminaste, ¿no es cierto?
You did end, Trevor, I believe. Thank you very much indeed. And I am happy to give the floor to Rodolfo. Rodolfo again. Well, yes, thanks very much. I can only echo a number of the points that have been made. Many of them are traditional in nature. We understand that any action of condemnation, of a restorative of action, etc., are classic. I added a few additional instruments that I did not see listed in the document, but which in no way intended to criticize or take away from the necessary action of vigilance and, where necessary, a denunciation of something that needs to be called out. Now, I agree that cooperation, education, and so forth are essential. Who could doubt it? Because that is going to be the ground upon which democracy must rest. However, I think even in civics classes, let's be clear, there is insufficient emphasis on the value of democracy for a population. It's not enough to say democracy is a wonderful thing. Democracy will defend your rights. Yeah, right. You need to explain more than that. How so? Because when populations are frustrated, when they've had it up to here, and when they're beginning to flirt with the possibility of other forms of government that, rest assured, are very attractive and make it their business to offer a siren song, well, then the results can be quite different. And so we need to explain bluntly, why does democracy matter? Because it is useful, above and beyond lofty ideals. It is democracies that have managed to offer higher levels of economic endeavor, greater social development, and they have done so in a context of freedom, of liberty with regard to human rights. Of course, you can't say it enough. I have a book of hardcore data on democracy in the Americas, more than 20,000 if you wanted to hear. But each one of these aim to explain bluntly, why is democracy the better way to go? Why? Health, education, you name it. If you compare what democracy has done, poverty, etc., fight against corruption, the fight against environmental pollution, greater involvement in environmental causes, etc., and so forth, on every one of those lists, point for point, democracy does better. Go ahead. We need to urge people to compare this. Take a look at every one of these rubrics and see what democracies have done compared to what other forms of government have done. Things going to speak for itself. Now, in the context of fighting crime, fighting a pandemic, distribution of wealth, even there, democracies are not ill-positioned compared to authoritarian governments. Now, some might say, look at that authoritarian government has managed to fight the pandemic better. Why don't we become authoritarian? Well, take a hard look, because the point here is that we need to take every chance we can to underscore that democracy is not just a lofty ideal, it's not just the nice, best thought way to go, it is because the facts show that they do better than the authoritarian regimes that you can think of. And we in Latin America know what we're talking about. Certainly. You know, we were willing to put up with a very great deal because we had seen what the lack of democracy could do. We had lived under dictatorships, so we were maybe willing to have a little more forgiving attitude towards democracy. But even from that standpoint, democracy does better, and we've got to be able to say so. You've got to be able to sell the thing. I'm happy to share my book with you. You will enjoy the hardcore facts. It's not easy reading. It has more than 92 tables. Good luck. But guess what? It is useful. Hits the nail on the head. And the point here is the following. It isn't just enough, I don't believe, to sing the paeans of democracy from a theoretical standpoint. We need to show that where it counts, democracies do better. Because here's the thing. When your campaign advisors, and I never fell into that trap, don't know whether you did, but I'm here to tell you, very often campaign advisors, God bless them, are told by their taskmasters, give me a populist speech because I've got to come across as a populist, says the candidate. Well, if that's what's going to sell, as in El Salvador, as in Bolivia, as in Nicaragua, as historically in Venezuela, as in Haiti, the list goes on, Honduras, those speeches do have some purchase on the population. That is true. So we got to be ready for that. They sell well. They sound great. The thing is, good luck on how the thing pans out. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. And bluntly, what I'm saying is we need to sell the practical value of democracy. 3 minutes, please, for our next speaker. Yes, indeed. I don't want to be repetitive. I want to be as succinct as possible, but maybe I'll speak from a different standpoint, says Santiago Ganton. The point of the Summit to the Americas was mentioned here, and I would say that the rapporteurship on freedom of expression is certainly one of the most important contributions that the summit process has offered us. And I think it is absolutely important for that those twin achievements to be recognized. Thinking of the next summit, by the way, positioning. Let us hope that the next summit goes back to being what the summit process once was, which was a cradle of ideas and practices that really made a difference. But let's be careful and not presume that we're all going to lean in the same direction. Now, back when dictatorship was rampant in the Southern Cone, the commission went ahead and came up at that point with the commission on Argentina in '79, when 2/3 of the states there were dictatorships. What does that tell you? It tells you that there have to be voices of independence. You know, we could be here till kingdom come and talk to civil society and talk to the states, yada, yada. But if you don't have a meeting of peers, a meeting of the minds, and an institutional format and framework in which that kind of independent thought can come forward, we're not going to go anywhere. And I want to say, after being 12 years in the commission, and I say this to Marie-Claire and others, and I certainly am willing to own up to numbers of the weaknesses of the commission. But I will say clearly that the commission must be more active, more vigorous, braver in issuing precautionary measures. It's essential. And I know that Joel was present and he did a number of other things, and reports have been drawn up here. It isn't that a new category or a new requirement above and beyond the traditional thought has been created, an extra hurdle. But let me say, even if that was not the intent, bottom line, that's what has happened, because the percentage of precautionary measures that the Commission comes is less 4% compared to what it was when it was more than 10% not that long ago in 2014, 2015. And today the Commission is most needed in this area. The Commission can and must be there in that regard. It's important, of course, to know, too, how the court will rule. Not saying the opposite. We've got to send more precautionary measures to the court, particularly as they regard independence of the judiciary. Don't be shy. Thank you very much. Marie-Claire, gotta push the button, dear friend. Yes. Well, I'll tell you what. I think I've already said what I had to say. But bluntly, here's what I would suggest. I don't know what organization, you name it, maybe the Carter Center, because the Carter Center has good friends within the, in the context of the Democratic Charter, or some other prestigious civil society entity, a task force. I don't care what it is, but we need a forum in which these matters that we're just talking about now can be delved into and result in concrete proposals to the next summit. That's where I'm going. Proposals to the next summit to ride on what has just been said, and that's all I had to say. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you, Marie-Claire. Joel Hernandez, any recommendations, any thoughts? Well, on the basis of what has just been said, what I think is that the entire role of the Inter-American Commission is in fact deeply rooted in the very issue we're discussing, that is strengthening of democracy. That's what it's about, is it not? And so when we refer to the present framework, the regulatory framework as regards the issuing of precautionary measures, well, a lot could be said. And indeed, the Commission would have a lot of explaining to do publicly in regards to the way that matter is exercised. But let me close with the following thought. I am convinced that the collective defense of democracy is a task that very much belongs in the lap of the Organization of American States, by which I mean that every principal consultative organ of this organization must participate. Let me say and note publicly what I think is essential. Look, the Commission comes up with an annual report every year. Under Chapter 4, you have 4A and 4B, wherein an analysis of the state of the promotion and protection of human rights in 35 countries is carried out for various reasons within the OAS. The report is presented to the General Assembly, and let me say it bluntly, it is a 15-minute presentation. It is merely a rubber stamping thing. It is a formal procedure. And that's an opportunity missed, particularly with regard to democratic institutionality, which should be the very basis on which the organs of the OAS can delve deeper. That's where I come down. And what a great joy it has been to be with all of you, dear friends, on this panel. Thank you, Joel, and thank you very much for the point you have just made. Most salient. The report of the Commission on the State of Democracy is a wellspring of most valuable thoughts and should be used much more intensely, much more clearly by every organ in the OAS, particularly as these relate to the promotion and protection of human rights. We all know that there's a link between democracy and human rights. And this has been reconfirmed by the recent consultative opinion of the court on presidential elections in the region, where it cites the court's opinion and takes it as a fundamental instrument in the defense of human rights. So all of this is there to to be used more wisely. All of the organs of the Neo-American system need to use them. Many, many thanks for your participation. It has been a very rich meeting, but Maria Celina Conte, before we end, will offer a few final remarks before, as I say, we adjourn. Thanks very much, Maria Celina Conte. You have the floor. Boundless thanks to all the experts that have been with us today. It has been an immense privilege to listen to you. It has been an extraordinarily rich and enriching dialogue. I think all of us, member states, various regional and intergovernmental organizations of the summit's process, civil society in the region, on behalf of the Summit Secretariat of the Americas and on behalf of the OAS itself, I cannot tell you how deeply satisfied we are with this policy dialogue, and we are very, very thankful to the IACHR and the Foundation on Due Process for being with us and in shepherding us through this immensely important debate. The participation of Mr. Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, and I, who have the honor of presenting here, together with the Summit Secretary Kevin O'Reilly, representative of the OAS to the summit, and the leadership in this country, which is doing so much to prepare for that summit. This country, I mean the OAS of the United States. Congratulations. And so thank you on my behalf to all of you, because it means that the Secretary General and others have been able to hear the viewpoints mentioned here, which do pick up on a lot that has been said in summits meetings and in the Permanent Council and various of the policy commissions, but all of it enriches and heightens the importance of each one of these sources and thoughts. Thank you for the strengthening of democracy, James Lambert. Thank you for your confidence. Thank you for your participation here. And most especially, let me say to you, Katia Salazar, how pleased we are and how fortunate we are that you were guiding these various panels and ensuring that this exchange would be even more enriching. They have allowed us, I believe, to understand better, we at the Summit Secretariat, how critical it is that the audience that is conformed by the states, by the organizations, that entire workings of the OAS is critical. And the summits last Saturday, as we know, 2 decades have passed since the charter was subscribed, pointing out what has been done, what needs to continue to be done. And in the present context, as all of you have underscored, it is ever more necessary, not less so, but more necessary, to be aware of the new challenges that democracies in the region must recognize as authoritarian and populist regimes take root, and which always aim to erode human rights, particularly at a time when health is a great concern. And that's precisely why we thought that this would be a very appropriate time to hold this meeting. That is an exchange on the state of democracy, riding on the session that was held in May, and taking advantage of this important anniversary, but also with a view to the next summit. So from all of the comments that have been made, and you can relax, I'm certainly not going to attempt to summarize. We've got this on tape, and we have, by that recording, a means to delve very deeply into the crux of what you all have said. Simply let me say that the approval of the Inter-American Democratic Charter was considered and remains a priority for the defense of democracy in the region. 20 years later, maybe in a different form, in more sophisticated modes and guises, as Katya has pointed out. We still need to show innovation, to show moxie, to have the courage to think out of the box, and to use the mechanisms that already exist in the Inter-American system more wisely, more effectively, whether it's accompanying missions or launching diplomatic initiatives to check into how the charter is doing, as Pisa was saying, or drawing up a working program, as Trevor mentioned, coming up with instruments, practical instruments that can make a difference in how the Inter-American Democratic Charter is being implemented, and not least how civil society sees it being useful. So these recommendations can go quite far. Let me also say that throughout this exchange, what has also been palpable, alas, is how democracy has been eroding. And in the face of that daunting challenge, it is agreed here that it has to be the whole of society that is roped in, as Marie-Claire pointed out, based on the Charter and its principles, the principles that need to be better understood by the citizenry, not forgetting that the most important measures that can lead to better defense of the rule of law rest, after all, on the shoulders of the citizenry, for good or ill. It's the citizens that are going to see it through.
Sin la cual no se puede.
Without it, we cannot, without compliance with the Democratic Charter, we can't move forward. Commissioner Hernandez says there has to be an approach to strengthen the independence of branches of government and to put an end to stigmatizing justice operators. Now, as to judicial independence, this is a fundamental element in all countries that operate under rule of law, and it's pending throughout the region. And independently of reforms that have taken place, there's evidence that the judiciary has been co-opted, and the main actors of the justice systems are in the pockets of the executive branch, and we have to counter this situation. Also, building and strengthening democracy has been raised by the commissioner about there must be independent judiciaries as well as help to states with the process of judge selection, the judges selection process. And so we also underscore the topic of effective diplomacy and the willingness of states to be able to engage in such efforts and identify the debts as has been pending debts, pending business, and urgent issues such as democratic deterioration, as Santiago pointed out. These must be dealt with. And Mr. Pisa. And so what can we do to ensure, Garen, democracy vis-a-vis urgent situations? And I just can mention a few things that you brought up, such as the need to forcefully act to defend the Inter-American Democratic Charter and the proposal to rethink this, the creation of a tool to enforce the Democratic Charter and the need to promote the awareness of the Democratic Charter. In addition to that, to work in education and cooperation assistance. This is absolutely key in this effort. Also, I mentioned the importance to distinguish between states that have democratic willingness and those that don't, and that have different tools that would make this effort to be effective, and that raise awareness about human rights in the throughout the continents, the hemisphere, which is what the Commission does, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. But currently, it's a challenge, and we have to be prepared for this because it limits the possibility, the scope of action of the political organs of the OAS. And this involves generally working in the area, as I said, education, promotion, and cooperation. Now, to wrap up, the Democratic Charter is a political and legal reference document. It's our roadmap which lays out the necessary elements that are required, but it is the states that have to take the decisions with regard to threats to the institutional framework in each country. And so these issues can not only be solved they can be solved by the role played by the different political sectors within each country, but we can't attribute to the charter democratic regression or any anti-democratic efforts of these states, and this has been happening throughout. But we need to take a strategic position with different strategic partners in innovative ways, and including diplomatic efforts. And then there's been a special focus on efforts to promote a democratic culture in the different countries of the hemisphere in view of the fact, and this I pulled out of one of the presentations from Marie Claire on another occasion, taking democracy and human rights as universal values. As the Secretary General mentioned, there's been a lot of efforts by the OAS to engage in actions to strengthen and the charter, to strike a balance and safeguard democracy. And as an example, we have defense of freedom of the press, freedom of expression, the promotion of transparency and probity in public administration, gender parity in elections, and the display of the electoral observation, deployment of these missions, electoral observation missions. But it's very clear that there's been an open effort to try to strengthen democracy, and this is a pending item on our agenda and the agenda of the OAS, and we will get back to it and continue to deal with it. So this has been very interesting, not only to the OAS, but in general, in the context of the summit's process. We know our hemisphere is on high alert, as has been mentioned by the Secretary General, with regard to sustainability and democratic gains. And so it's fundamental to continue to figure out different ways to translate this into a common effort, and to continue to listen to those who have been working on behalf of strengthening democratic governance throughout the region, and to preserve this balance of power and safeguard democracy. In this regard, the 9th summit will become a very appropriate setting to move forward in this area. Despite different ideological differences of different states, this will not be an easy debate, but it's necessary in the spirit at first to maintain a defense of democracy. And I wrap up with that. Not before thanking each and every one of you from the Summit Secretariats of the OAS, and we hope to be able to have your contributions on another opportunity. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria Celine. Thank you.